Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachersfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that out of all the things Abigail Adams could have been angry at Thomas Jefferson about, it was the pardoning of an American journalist that she took the most offense to? That Alexander Hamilton died in a duel in 1804 in the exact spot that his son had stood years earlier, also fighting in a duel. And that while Lewis and Clark didn't find a true waterway to the Pacific, their incredible 3-year journey that lasted thousands of miles may not have been able to happen if they hadn't run into a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea who was willing to help them. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 95, the election of 1804, and the Lewis and Clark expedition. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 95. The book recommendation for today is War of Two, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, and the Duel That Stunned the Nation by John Sedgwick. This is a really great book. Obviously, you can probably figure out what it talks about. It goes into detail about the rivalry between Hamilton and Burr and the subsequent duel that they fought that killed Alexander Hamilton. And actually, for those of you who are patrons of the show, later this week, I am releasing a special bonus Patreon episode all about the rivalry between Hamilton and Burr and the details of the duel, and then really Aaron Burr's subsequent political craziness that is... It's pretty hard to believe the things that this guy did or tried to do. But check out that Patreon bonus episode later this week to learn more about that. Speaking of Patreon, thanks to our two newest patrons. Really appreciate your support. Hope I'm pronouncing your names right. Two Davids, David Sheriff and David Myhill. I know at least one of them has been a long-time listener of the show, and now they're both supporting patrons. And we're getting closer and closer to me not having to personally financially subsidize the show. So I really appreciate that. All right, let's get into episode 95 here. Last week, we dove into arguably the boldest executive action in the history of the United States, the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon and the French. If you recall, as Robert Livingston was trying to negotiate some type of purchase of the port of New Orleans, Jefferson decided to try to take more of a direct role in the negotiations, sending his confidant and trusted friend, James Monroe, to Paris to assist Livingston in the process. As Monroe was delayed and then eventually on his way to France, Livingston began to pick up on clues that Napoleon had lost his attempts to reclaim Santo Domingo and that the war with England was likely on the horizon and occupying most of Napoleon's focus. Acting quickly, Livingston struck a deal with Napoleon, one that many of Napoleon's advisors, including his brothers, strongly recommended that he not move forward with. I spoke about the overjoyed reaction back home. I mean, heck, Thomas Jefferson was beside himself with glee when he heard the news. Men like Horatio Gates and Andrew Jackson wrote to Jefferson about how incredible the purchase was, and Thomas Paine even surmised that if the French could take out England in war, Canada may one day also be available. As we know, though, Jefferson was less than thrilled about the political implications of the deal and was worried about the expanded executive power that came with it. We left off last week with Jefferson pushing the purchase to a vote in Congress, one that passed without too much drama. As the calendar began to turn to 1804, though, many of the eastern and New England states were worried about the most recent developments. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory seemed to undeniably favor the southern and western states, putting them at a significant disadvantage politically, socially, and economically. For these reasons, some of the New England Federalists who were growing more weary of Jefferson's power began to have very real conversations about secession. As Jefferson began to think about a potential second term, he found himself growing on much of the American population. His grace, both publicly and privately, along with his natural hospitality in both the White House and where he traveled, made many critics close friends, and socially disarmed even his most strident political opponents. Few could deny that Thomas Jefferson was incredibly socially gifted. He recognized that the power of social connection could help to blunt the pervasive trend of political division, while simultaneously making the task of pushing his platform through Congress that much easier. And to many, his conviviality that Jefferson displayed only further angered and stressed out those Federalists who so desperately wanted to see Jefferson somehow defeated in the upcoming election. Something that we will come to find out was really just a pipe dream. The Federalists' worst fears had come to bear, as obvious as it was to everyone when the Republican caucus chose Thomas Jefferson to represent their party once again in the election of 1804. With Jefferson's re-election campaign beginning to pick up some momentum, there immediately became questions about whether or not Jefferson would once again run with Aaron Burr as his vice presidential candidate. Burr, fully aware that he had fallen out of public favor in the past few years and had also managed to make quite a few enemies within his own party, agreed to meet with Jefferson to propose some type of solution. He told Jefferson he would be willing to step aside for the election of 1804 and allow Jefferson to choose another running mate if, in fact, Jefferson would then give him a federal appointment in his next administration. Unfortunately for Burr, Jefferson declined his offer and refused to make such a promise, just as he had when he was approached by Federalists during the House votes when the Electoral College had tied in the election of 1800. If nothing else, we've come to find that Thomas Jefferson really refused to do things that were politically convenient if they somehow conflicted with his moral and political values. In the spring of 1804, Jefferson's daughter Polly passed away, putting Thomas into a pretty depressed state. He had traveled back to Monticello to be with her, but decided after her death to head right back to D.C. Upon arriving in D.C., he was a bit surprised to receive a letter from none other than Abigail Adams, a letter in which she empathized with him, seeing as she had also lost a child too young. It was in this correspondence back and forth that Abigail Adams eventually unloaded on Jefferson. In response to a letter in which Jefferson lamented the dissolution of their friendship, Abigail pulled no punches, telling Jefferson that while he took office from her husband, she did not necessarily blame him for that. It was how it was done that so angered her. The horrible things said about John Adams during the campaign of 1796 and especially during the campaigns of the election of 1800, and Jefferson's almost immediate pardon of James Callender, the man who wrote many of these vile things, in Abigail's mind was a betrayal of the highest order. Jefferson tried to explain himself by claiming that he only released Callender from prison because of his staunch opposition to the sedition laws that put him there in the first place. After 7 letters went back and forth, the two had made no real progress, and the relationship between Jefferson and the Adams family seemed to be on life support. But while there was drama going on privately between Jefferson and Abigail Adams, there was an even more public drama happening in New York, in an event that robbed the United States of one of its most brilliant politicians, while shocking the public conscience. On July 11th, 1804, the sitting Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr, shot and killed the former Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey. These two men had grown to truly hate each other over the years, with Alexander Hamilton protesting Burr's electoral chances in both 1796 and 1800. When Jefferson and Burr deadlocked in 1800, Hamilton was then influential in eventually convincing the House of Representatives to vote for Jefferson, which we know probably wasn't easy for him to swallow. Once Burr recognized that Jefferson was not going to give him the opportunity to run as vice president again in 1804, he was recruited to run for governor of New York. And unsurprisingly, during that campaign, Hamilton once again swung his political weight, speaking out strongly against Burr and admonishing his character in the worst of ways. When the election was over, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel to restore his honor. Now, the challenge itself, this challenge of honor, wasn't all that uncommon. The actual event of the duel was sort of uncommon, though. Because usually when there's some type of challenge of honor, these things were settled prior to actually lining up and pulling a trigger. But in this case, that didn't happen. At 7 a.m., these two met. Burr fired and shot Hamilton in the gut, with him passing away the next day. Like I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, I'm going to be releasing a bonus Patreon episode all about the rivalry between these two men. And I definitely recommend you check it out. Not only is the rivalry itself fascinating, but like I mentioned, what Burr tried to do after the duel is in some ways even crazier. With Burr being indicted for murder in both New York and New Jersey, he decided to travel west to concoct a plan to secede the western states from the rest of the nation. Jefferson's reaction to the news of Hamilton's death was nothing short of curious. Jefferson said, well, nothing. Like nothing. With news of the death of such a great U.S. politician, one would expect the President of the United States and a former fellow cabinet member of the deceased to say something, anything. But with the election of 1804 on the horizon, Jefferson decided to remain 100% silent on the issue. He was hoping that people would view it as a solemn silence. But as you could probably anticipate, not everyone did. Jefferson believed that the Federalists were jumping at Hamilton's death as an opportunity to not only eulogize him, which in some ways was probably very genuine and authentic, but use it as another opportunity to create some type of political leverage out of this horrific event. Jefferson, with this in mind, wanted to do everything he could to stay out of the fray. But it was actions like these from the Federalists that convinced Jefferson to once again run for president, even though in the summer of 1804 he swore up and down that he had only planned on serving one term and just wanted to retire humbly to Monticello. Sure you did, Tom. George Clinton replaced Burr as the Republican vice presidential candidate. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the man who had run with John Adams 4 years earlier, was Jefferson's Federalist challenger. But in what ended up being one of the most lopsided elections in American history, Pinckney stood no chance. The people were happy. America was prosperous. And, just over a year ago, Thomas Jefferson literally doubled the United States for pennies an acre in the Louisiana Purchase. So, Jefferson won the electoral vote, 162 to 14. Yep, you heard me, 162 to 14. It was with this vote that the Federalist Party's influence in American politics was officially over. And I mean really over. And look, this election was truly a referendum on the Louisiana Purchase. In the first 4 years of Jefferson's presidency, he had established a government that was partly Federalist and partly Republican. He operated the federal government in a limited Republican way, except for when the nation would be better suited otherwise. As he prepared for his second inaugural address, Jefferson looked back on his time in politics and appreciated just how far he and this young nation had come. With that said, he recognized that with a successful first term, the expectations for him in his second term would likely be significantly higher. As the calendar turned to 1805, Jefferson was considering the various situations overseas that still threatened the security of his nation, either directly or indirectly. He knew eventually that he would have to deal with the perceived Spanish control of North American land. Napoleon was still on the rise. Our relationship with England was strained now since we had just written a $15 million check to their primary rival, and he was still dealing with the Barbary pirates, capturing American merchant ships and demanding ransoms, something that had been going on really the entire first term, and we're not going to be diving too deep into in this podcast. But if you want to look it up, feel free to do that. Sort of interesting stuff. Giving another inaugural speech that was spoken too softly for anyone to actually hear, Thomas Jefferson began to turn his attention to the political task that lay in front of him, while musing about his own future. He had been one who originally advocated for a single 7-year term for the presidency, but had now become fond of this idea of 4-year terms. Ideally, though, he believed that one should follow in the footsteps of George Washington, and the footsteps that John Adams had hoped to have laid down in front of him. Jefferson believed that one should retire after 2 4-year terms, at the most. It seemed like the expectation of 8 years with the ability to remove a president halfway through, like what happened to John Adams, was an agreeable approach to the office. Jefferson's primary concern was that eventually someone would be able to command such power over the electorate that he would be re-elected again and again. I mean, this guy was just so afraid of monarchy. With that in mind, and American political precedent potentially hanging in the balance, Jefferson privately committed himself to following in Washington's footsteps, writing that, quote, General Washington set the example of voluntary retirement after 8 years. I shall follow it, and a few more precedents will oppose the obstacle of habit to anyone after a while who shall endeavor to extend his term. Perhaps it may beget a disposition to establish it by an amendment of the Constitution. There is, however, but one circumstance which could engage my acquiescence in another election, to wit, such a division about a successor might bring in a monarchist. But this circumstance is impossible. The primary political concern for Jefferson in the year 1805 was that of the Spanish occupation of land in North America. Spain was still allied with France, and the borders of the Louisiana Purchase had not been fully settled between the U.S. and Spain. Monroe was sent over to Spain to negotiate, but wasn't able to make much progress. Jefferson was then faced with a couple different options. The U.S. could get into a fight with Spain about the borders, but seeing as they were allied with France, that probably wasn't the best idea. They could also ally themselves with Britain, sending a clear message to both Spain and France that they were going to dig their heels in on this issue. Jefferson, though, after much consideration, decided to take the third approach. Like the two presidents before him, Jefferson ignored the emotional pleas for war and decided that peace was the best option and the one that America should pursue. And Jefferson determined that kicking the can down the road, at least for now, was the most prudent approach to the issue. But things weren't all stressful and anxiety-provoking for President Jefferson at this time. lest we not forget that William Clark and Meriwether Lewis were still heading west in their exploration and would soon have good news for the president. Lewis and Clark had met on the Ohio River in October of 1803 to begin their expedition. They recruited hunters, carpenters, and boat builders for their trip. They had hired a translator and had the help of a loyal slave named York. York was given many more freedoms and responsibilities than he otherwise would have been and played a key role in the success of the mission. And York's story is a pretty fascinating one, and I would recommend looking more into it if you're interested, especially considering the fact that he was a slave. The men traveled up the Ohio and Mississippi rivers and into the Missouri River. They camped in St. Louis for the winter and began to travel up the Missouri River in May of 1804 to officially begin the expedition. As they traveled, both Lewis and Clark collected skeletons and bones of animals and plants. They created sketches of unique animals that they had encountered, and they did their best to peacefully negotiate and communicate with the natives who lived on that land. The men continued along the Missouri through the Dakotas, encountering and negotiating with more and more native tribes. They then camped at Fort Mandan in the winter of 1805. It was at this time that the men hired a translator to help them in their journey. This translator happened to be married to a Shoshone Native American named Sacagawea. Now, Sacagawea was interested in coming along for the trip, considering the men were headed in the direction of Shoshone land, and she had a desire to be reunited with her people. As the expedition progressed, Sacagawea proved herself to be an incredible asset and an invaluable translator, sort of like a bonus that Lewis and Clark didn't really expect. She knew all about which plants were edible, where to hunt, and assisted in taking care of not only the men, but also her newborn son, Jean-Baptiste. In the spring of 1805, the group continued west along the Mississippi River, finally laying their eyes on the Rocky Mountains in May of 1805. In the early summer, they reached present-day Great Falls, Montana, with Lewis describing the incredible waterfalls as the, quote, greatest sight I ever beheld. After spending about a month navigating around Great Falls, they finally found the source of the Missouri River, a small stream in the Rocky Mountains. Not a river that goes all the way to the Pacific, like they had hoped. By October of 1805, they had traveled further across the Rockies and laid their eyes on the Columbia River in the distance. Quickly realizing that this ran through the heart of the Rockies, they were a bit disenchanted because they needed horses, and they didn't have any. Enter once again Sacagawea. Naturally, since she was Shoshone, she could have been relied on for negotiations anyway, but in an incredible twist of fate, her brother was actually the chief of the local village that they were encountering. The men were able to trade some of their goods for horses to continue their journey. While on their difficult trek through the mountains, they ran into the Nez Perce, who assisted them with directions west. Eventually, they were on to the Columbia River and heading west, recognizing that the Pacific probably wasn't too far away. In the spring of 1805, Jefferson received his first communications from the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson had heard from William Clark specifically. He received journal entries from him. In the correspondences that Jefferson got, both Clark and Lewis, to a certain extent, were very confident that they would be successful in their task of reaching the Pacific, and were looking forward to debriefing Jefferson on their experiences. They had also sent bones from various animals and plants specific to the region of the area that they're traveling through in the Louisiana Territory. On December 3rd, 1805, William Clark was able to look out over the Pacific Ocean and bask in the glory of the incredible achievement that he and his men had worked so hard for. Beginning all the way in Washington, D.C., and traveling over 3,000 miles, they had finally made it to the other side of the continent. Camping for the winter of 1805 and 1806, the men set out on their return trip in March of 1806. The way back was quite a bit easier, since they were navigating downstream, but both men deviated from their original path, trying to find the waterway to the Pacific that had so eluded them on their trek west. But they weren't able to. And on September 23rd, 1806, the men arrived back in St. Louis, which has since been nicknamed the Gateway to the West. And in case you're wondering, yes, that is why there is a Gateway Arch in St. Louis, seeing as the men sort of officially began and ended in St. Louis. It is often referred to as, like I mentioned, the Gateway to the West. With construction finishing, by the way, in 1965, the arch was dedicated to the American people and stands as the tallest arch in the world and the tallest man-made monument in the Western Hemisphere. And if you ever go to St. Louis, I would recommend you check it out. It's pretty awesome. Oh, and let Bill know, because that's where he lives. As you pack up your things, keep in mind that while Jefferson had won his re-election campaign, he still had a lot on his mind. The Spanish were being obstinate about the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase. The British, French, and African pirates were harassing American shipping and blunting our economic progress on the high seas. Oh, and Napoleon just kept winning. Oh, and back in the U.S., the former VP Aaron Burr was actively plotting against Thomas Jefferson's presidency and the United States of America, something that, like I mentioned, we'll dive deeper into in the Patreon episode. As I mentioned before, Jefferson's first instinct was to seek out a peaceful resolution to foreign and domestic threats. But as we'll come to find next week, that was a lot harder to accomplish than he would have liked. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.